This podcast is sponsored by Lightstep. Lightstep delivers confidence at scale for those who develop, operate, and rely upon today's powerful software applications. Answer questions and diagnose 100% of anomalies, spanning mobile, monoliths, and microservices across every service in real time. Visit lightstep.com.
Academic computer science potentially has a lot to offer the mainstream computing industry, but the two disciplines don't always work together as well as they could. A company within the cloud infrastructure space that strives to increase this collaboration is HashiCorp. I'm sure, like me, many of you know and love the HashiCorp infrastructure tooling, such as Consul and Vault, but did you also know that many of the features offered within these tools are based on sound computer science research? Hello, I'm Daniel Bryant, co-host of the InfoQ podcast, news manager at InfoQ, and product architect at DataWire. And I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Armon Dadgar, who's the co-founder and CTO of HashiCorp, at the QCon New York conference. Alongside Mitchell Hashimoto, Armon founded HashiCorp over 6 years ago now, and the company has gone from strength to strength. HashiCorp offers 4 core infrastructure tools, such as Consul, Nomad, Vault, and Terraform, and their tech can be found anywhere from small-scale European startups to many of the US-based Fortune 500 companies, and elsewhere around the world too. As you'll hear in the podcast, I share an academic background with Armon, and I was keen to understand how his time as an undergraduate research assistant at the University of Washington influenced the foundation of the HashiCorp tech stack. We'll discuss the formation of the HashiCorp research division within HashiCorp itself, explore some of the computer science research underpinning Consul and Nomad, and we'll talk about the balance of research and commercial interests. We'll also explore how the HashiCorp tooling and support processes have been evolving, how Armon and the team have been supporting organizations migrating to the cloud, which, let's be honest, is no small task for many traditional IT organizations, and we'll briefly cover the new learn.hashicorp.com website and the accompanying community and support forums. You can already find me asking a bunch of questions in there, and hopefully I'll be answering a few more in the future too. We'll wrap up the conversation with a brief discussion of the trade-offs of standardization within computing infrastructure and identify when it might be beneficial and also when it might not be beneficial to embrace this. Related to this, Armon offers his thoughts around the new Service Mesh Interface, SMI, which was announced recently at KubeCon EU, and he shares why he believes that computer networking interoperability is so important as we move from a homogeneous IT infrastructure landscape to one that is formed of a multi-cloud, multi-platform world. The following podcast was recorded live at QCon New York, and so apologies for any audio issues. Please excuse the sound of the elevator dings, and a couple of folks accidentally entered the room midway through the podcast too. Every QCon is full of speakers and attendees looking to network and find quiet areas to discuss ideas, and to be honest, it's almost impossible to find a completely isolated space at times. Hopefully this won't detract from your listening experience. I always enjoy chatting to Armon, always learn a bunch of new things, and I'm hoping you will too. We're here at QCon New York. Appreciate you taking time today, Armon. I know your schedule is super busy, and you are talking in just a minute, actually. But the title of your talk really caught my eye. As an ex-academic myself, you're talking about sort of bringing research like from industry to academia and vice versa. Slightly different to what you usually talk about. What was the motivation for doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question that we often get because people, I don't know if some people who follow the company closely will notice we have HashiCorp Research, right? And it's sort of unusual for a startup to have a research department, right? It's unusual for a very large company to have a research department, let alone a tiny startup. And I think we first started HashiCorp Research when we were 30 people. It's really tiny. We had a research group. And so I think it's a question we often get, which is just why do you have it? How do they work? How do they integrate with the rest of engineering? What's their goals, right? But I think the other thing people often notice and are thankful of with HashiCorp products is how much there's kind of core fundamental computer science at the basis of them.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of those three kind of questions sort of came together of hey, how do you guys think about research? How does it get incorporated in product? What's the role of HashiCorp research? And Cindy sort of asked me, hey, would you kind of bring those together and give a talk about that? And I was yeah, sure. I don't think we've ever spoken about it publicly.
Super interesting. So Cindy was actually definitely saying good things about you at the keynote this morning. She got to pitch the track, and she was saying a lot of the HashiCorp tech is sort of built on foundational computer science kind of algorithms and thinking and research. Is there anything that jumps to mind as your team's proudest accomplishment of taking something that's kind of feels academic and making it into a product?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two to me that have the most baked in that it's sort of invisible is probably Consul and Nomad. Mm-hmm. I think we've done a good job making it invisible, but it's kind of crazy when you look at the list of things that Consul has under the hood. At the core of it is a consensus algorithm, right? So it has Raft and a bunch of extensions in terms of how we do replication and data consistency. but then it has a distributed gossip layer as well. So there's a whole gossip protocol as well there, right? And that has a whole bunch of extensions that we've pulled in from different pieces of literature. On top of that, we built this network coordinate system, which I think is super cool. It's my most underrated feature of Consul, is that because all the nodes are talking to each other in the background, what we actually do is basically build a GPS for your network, right? So every node ends up getting assigned a network coordinate, which is sort of a 6-dimensional coordinate. And you can use these to say how far apart is any two nodes. And the system's usually right to within about 10% accuracy. So you can say these two nodes, and it'll say, hey, those are 5 milliseconds apart on the network. And so let's say we do really neat things like nearest neighbor routing to say like route me to the nearest MySQL or the nearest Memcache on a network distance basis. So there's all of this kind of cool tech that exists in there. There's like the list just keeps going on and on of like things we've baked into Consul. But I think the user experience is just like, yeah, it just sort of works. You don't think about the fact that there's all this technology under the hood. And I think that's the fun art of it, is like how do you package it up so that it has that like, you don't know that all this cool stuff is there, but the cool stuff is all there.
So I know that Google famously kind of publish papers and so forth. Does HashiCorp publish papers?
Yes. So actually we have our own novel extension to the gossip protocol called Lifeguard that we published last year. Twitch, who's a big user of Consul, they've talked publicly about their usage, was having this issue of like when they were getting DDoSed, because they get all these, script kiddies will like sort of attack them. When they were getting DDoSed, it would cause like widespread instability in the Consul cluster. And so we were spending time with them trying to like understand like why is it that like when your front end servers are getting DDoSed, your like back end Consul systems are being like randomly impacted. And we found out that there's this sort of problem at the heart of a lot of gossip, which is it's fundamentally cooperative. If you tell me a node is dead, I sort of believe you, right? We're cooperating, and that's how we scale this. But what happens when like you're unhealthy, but you're telling me some third node is unhealthy, right? So you're sort of poisoning the well of these other nodes.
Yeah.
So like, how do you actually make the system resilient to the fact that nodes that are cooperating might not actually be themselves trustworthy or healthy, right? And so we published this sort of paper on Lifeguard, sort of swimming with situational awareness.
Oh, I love the name.
And so that was actually like really fun to kind of give back to the community. And the work actually ended up in Chef Habitat as well as Cassandra. So their gossip protocol ended up adopting some of the extensions.
And did you present that like at an academic conference, or was it purely online, like paper? Because I know some folks, like back in my academic days, you used to go to quite stuffy conferences, present your novel findings, and industry was almost sneered at a little bit,
right.
Sometimes, probably wrongly. But I wondered, did you present the paper anywhere other than like industry?
So we did put the pre-publication on archive. I think that's becoming like the norm now, but we did present at DSN actually. So DSN is an academic conference that has an industry track. So we presented at the industry track of DSN, which is otherwise an academic conference.
Awesome. And what was the reception like?
People were warm to it, and it was funny that the original SWIM authors, right, the basis of the paper was SWIM as the underlying gossip protocol. They actually emailed us and were like, hey, this is super cool, and like we're excited and thankful that you guys like took the work and ran with it and like extended it. So it was kind of neat to like engage with the original authors on this stuff.
It's kind of nice, because one thing I took away from my academic days is standing on the shoulders of giants. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my professor at the time was really drilling into me, look cross-discipline and always stand on the shoulders of giants. And I think outside of academia, in tech in general, we don't do that often enough. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. We don't always look to the past,
right?
Which I think is a bit tricky. So it's kind of nice to be able to, give stuff back and help other people build on more on your existing work.
Yeah, and I think, that's something that, I think me and you have a sort of shared background, which is right at that precipice of like, do I want to stay in academia or do I want to go into industry? Because I spent most of my university time doing research, and I actually, got into a PhD program. I ended up dropping out to join a startup.
Every good founder does.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, I was personally very torn because I love that side of it. I love that notion of like, how do you build on the shoulders of giants and sort of extend their work and solve new problems? And I think it was important to us to like bring that back to HashiCorp, right? Of that same sort of approach. And I think that's why we're sort of weirdly academic for a startup.
Yeah, I must confess, I didn't know about the actual research group only recently. And it is genuinely impressive. Like, even now you're not a huge company, but as in very efficient to the kind of resources people you have. How do you balance the industry need to sort of, make money and so forth with the academia?
I'm going to talk about this too during my talk, which is part of it is the charter of the group is very specifically industrial research, right? And that's a distinction I'd make from like a bigger group from like Microsoft research, where it's like you could be a researcher who's working on, the theoretical bounds of some algorithm, moving it from n to the 40th to n to the 38th. You're like, that's interesting theoretical work, but there's no practical impact of an algorithm that has n to the 38th complexity, right? Like there just isn't. So that kind of work is like, that's cool, and I'm glad that takes place in academic circles and certain sort of research groups, but not something HashiCorp can invest in. So for us, the kind of industrial focus means that it's like, it has to be something that is either applicable to our products or is something within 18 to 24 months of what we think the market would actually be able to use. So work like Lifeguard was like, yeah, this today makes the system made the system 98% more stable than it was without our extensions. You're like, okay, that's practical. Very large clusters today will get this enormous stability benefit. And you're like, great, that's cool research. And now we're working on some stuff around Vault, around can we do automated configuration of the system to make it more secure? You're like, that's a today problem, right? It's not a theoretical future problem. So I think part of it is just making sure that it's like, okay, if this can ultimately end up in product, then it's easier to justify that investment of like, this is going to help our users, right, and our customers, and so it makes sense to invest in this.
I guess it's always one of those things like sort of the like 3 horizons. I think McKinsey say like you need to place your bets accordingly, right. And I think the moonshots as they call them are always super interesting, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so this is probably like if engineering is the first horizon, our research group is our second horizon. Like one day maybe we're big enough to invest in sort of the third horizon. Yeah, exactly.
HashiCorp to space.
Exactly.
I actually wouldn't mind to dial it back to the HashiCorp products at the moment, because there's so much exciting stuff popping up at the moment. Like recently myself was playing around with Terraform 0.12, super interesting upgrades. Consul, going to the service mesh. Vault, you mentioned, doing super interesting stuff already. Like, could you give us a brief overview of kind of where we're at now with HashiCorp and where you see like the company in the next, say, 6 months, 12 months? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because there's just so much going on. I think, if I looked across the portfolio, in some sense, we haven't released a new tool since 2015, right? So I think the first few years of the company, people were used to like, hey, every 6 to 12 months, HashiCorp releases like a major new product, right? And our view was at the time, there's these huge gaps that exist in sort of tooling in the market, right? So it's like, you need a thing that can do provisioning like Terraform. You need a thing that can do security like Vault. You need a thing that can do networking like Consul. You need schedulers like Nomad. So we were sort of building out what we saw as these big missing gaps. And since then, it's been kind of a constant refinement process where I think there's been sort of, I'll call it 2 or 3 kind of common investments. One has been, how do you make this tooling go from like expert level user to like, okay, it's less intimidating for me to start with a Terraform or less intimidating for me to start with a Vault. And I think that's a big investment in terms of like sanding down the edges, getting the getting started experience good, making the UIs really nice, like polishing the CLI. Like there's a ton of investment we put there. And some of that's just honestly documentation and learn.hashicorp.com of like, how do you make it easy, right? So that's one big investment. The other one has been, infrastructure lives and dies by integrations, right? Like no infrastructure that's successful is hermetically sealed, right? And I think we saw a bit of that, mismanagement around things like Docker or Swarm was it sort of refused to integrate with the ecosystem around it, right? Where I think we've always taken that view, like you have to integrate with everything. And so I think a big investment for us has been, what are these big communities, whether it's Kubernetes, whether now it's all the serverless offerings the clouds have of like, okay, how do you invest in making that work with Terraform and Consul and Vault? And like, there's a bunch of product level stuff you have to do, right? So that's part of it. And then the third one is just the maturing of the tools, making them much more stable under scale, making them sort of, enterprise ready in quotes, right? All of that kind of good work of like, how do you take it from a .1, hey, this is a cool idea, to like, no, this thing is battle hardened and can like operate at scale in big production environments, right? And I think those have been our big investments. And I think kind of if you look at where we're going, it's sort of those same key trends, right? As it's like, we don't want radical departures, right? Because at this point, people are using this stuff in prod.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So it's scary if you're like, hey, by the way, the next version is going to be a radical departure, right? So I think it has to be a little bit more incremental around those kind of big themes.
Interesting. So one thing I definitely picked up on was the community portal. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of, at first glance, compared to all the amazing tech like HashiCorp's got, it seemed quite simple. But at the same time, I know from personal experience, bringing people along on the journey, because more and more people kind of roll up, they're adopting cloud, they're adopting containers. All this stuff is pretty new and pretty scary, particularly if you're coming from sort of, the heritage kind of space. Is that like a very much a conscientious or conscious choice, I should say, of we're really going to invest in sort of the onboarding and the teaching aspect of the tooling?
Yeah, because I think what we've seen is, in some senses, like the market has said, yeah, this tooling matters, right? And we see broad adoption of all of it. But the challenge is, okay, great, if I want to bring Terraform into my org, it's not enough that one person knows Terraform. It's like, okay, well, how do me and my 50 colleagues learn Terraform?
Yeah.
So I think that's where we've made a big investment in like learn.hashicorp.com, which is like our big sort of learning platform, and it's sort of self-guided, and you go through tutorials, and there's a team of like 18 people who work on the content behind that.
Oh,
yeah, it's
18?
like, it's big. Yeah,
that is big.
So it's like, that's one big thing, right? And then the community portal has been a second sort of struggle we've had, which is our community has been fragmented across so many different things. It's like, you see questions in Stack Overflow, questions in, Gitter, questions in IRC, questions in Slack, questions in our Google group, right? It's sort of all Stack Overflow. It's sort of, it was all over the place. And so you'd end up answering the same questions in 10 different forums all the time, right? And so we said, how do we bring that all together so that, great, when you Google, hey, how do I do this thing with Terraform? That it's always like, oh yeah, it's in the community portal, and someone's answered it and you can see it, right? So it's just sort of centralized in one place. So it's like sort of a Stack Overflow for HashiCorp, if you will, right? And pull it all together. So I think that's important when you talk about exactly what you're saying of like, how do you bring people along this journey, right? It's like, hey, you have a question, there's one place to go. You want to learn how things done, there's one place you go that has the guidance of how you do it, right? And I think later this year we're even going to roll out things like certification, because what we hear from companies is like, hey, I want to hire somebody who knows Terraform to come work for me. But it's, with all new technologies, like, people just like putting on their resume sometimes. So it's like, what we get asked all the time is like, okay, when I say they know Terraform, does it mean they know how to spell Terraform, or they know actually how to do something with Terraform?
Very different things.
Yeah, exactly. So I think part of the goal of certification is helping both, hey, if I'm an expert, how do I signal that to employers? But as an employer, how do I say, okay, well, I want some baseline competence. What does that mean, right? Do I say I need level 1, level 2 certification of these different things?
That's very interesting. So sort of slightly related to this, and what we were talking about sort of off mic, is in that the industry itself now is gone on quite a fair clip, and there's so many different technologies out there. Part of the challenge as a technologist is, where do I invest my time? And if you're a leader in the company, it's like you've got a whole bunch of choices and your team's going to be following in your footsteps. Do you think you're going to be adding any documentation in that respect? Or is it a case of, you've already invested sort of into HashiCorp tooling, here's how you use it? Or will you provide any kind of overviews of, here's why maybe you shouldn't use it, or here there are alternatives?
Of like our own tooling, you mean?
Yeah, I'm just thinking in general, because the cloud native space is quite confusing. You can deploy probably, I don't know, many different ways. And I'm wondering, because Terraform is super flexible and that you can spin up kind of any aspect of the cloud, people, I wonder, almost need guidance of what should they be using.
Right.
Should it be serverless? Should it be containers? Should it be
I see.
That kind of thing?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So that makes sense. I mean, it's a tough question, because I think in some sense it's like you never see technology standardize, right? It's like, if you look at like any large company, they have everything. And when I say everything, I mean literally mainframe, bare metal, VM. And when they have VM, I mean they have OpenStack and VMware, and they have Nutanix, right? So it's like, and then it's like, now they're gonna have every version of container and every version of serverless. So I think the reality is, very rarely do we see organizations have the discipline to say, this is the technology we're standardizing on, and this is a top-down thing that we maintain strict discipline. It usually ends up being sort of a hodgepodge of, we have it all. And so I think part of our goal goes back to that notion of integration, which is like knowing that you're going to have it all, right? Like, we don't want you to end up with, here's my provisioning tool for VMs, and my provisioning tool for container, and my provisioning tool for serverless. It's like, no, you just have Terraform. It's a provisioning tool, and it can handle bare metal, VM, container, serverless, right? Because I think that is the reality of most organizations, for better or worse, honestly.
I think any enterprise, particularly like through merger and acquisitions, and just like the way it goes, and over time things just grow and change, don't they? Sort of on that note, very interested like in some of the announcements from like say like CNCF and other kind of places coming up now with trying to standardize certain layers in the stack. So we've mentioned SMI earlier on, the service mesh interface. I was kind of curious, obviously HashiCorp involved in that, super interesting. What's your thoughts around the standardization of kind of key layers of the stack now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of torn views here, right? Which is like, I think one, obviously we're a big participant in SMI. So SMI particularly, the reason I think it's interesting is that the network is such a key, in some sense it's like, what makes it work that you can have a mainframe and a bare metal and a VM and a container all on one network is the fact that the network was this great common denominator, right? Yeah. As long as I can speak TCP, my serverless thing can talk to my mainframe. And that's kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, you can span 40 years of technology because the network makes that possible, right? So at certain levels, I think you need to have standardization because you need interoperability, right? Anywhere you need interoperability, you need a standard, right? Yeah. If I don't need interoperability, like for example, the API vSphere uses to boot a VM, right? That API has literally nothing to do with OpenStack, literally nothing to do with Nutanix. But the way that I provision a VM on VMware, it doesn't really matter if that's the same as on OpenStack, right? I don't need interop. Where the network, I need interop. So part of it to me is like, you need a standard when that's really important, right? That's one side where it's important. The other places where switching costs would be really high, really extreme, right? Like in the cases where if your switching cost was crazy, like a good example of that is I think the tracing space, right? Or any of the sort of telemetry space, right? Like I want to have one type of SDK that I put in my app to export my telemetry, but today I might use Datadog, tomorrow I might use AppD, third day maybe I home roll my own system, whatever, right? But if I had to say, okay, now I'm going to go retool 500 applications because I used a Datadog specific format, that would be a huge nightmare. My switching costs would be just horrendous, basically, right? So I think those become some of these key points at which having an interface makes sense. The other side of it is these markets right now are so dynamic, so rapidly evolving that it's very hard sometimes to build these standards, right? Because it's sort of like, when a standard works really well is when you're like, okay, I kind of understand 95% of the functionality here, and now we want an interface that will cover that 95%. But it's like, if I understand 5% of it and the other 95 we're still kind of experimenting and discovering and evolving, then a standard is so hard, right? Because the standard is evolving just as rapidly as the technology.
Yeah, I've seen some of that in my Java time. My Java was a bit awkward.
Exactly.
So, final question. I really appreciate your time today. What excites you most about the industry at the moment? What are you most looking forward perhaps to working with or seeing others work with?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's this sort of march up the stack. It's sort of funny to me, which is, in some sense, I started HashiCorp, which is like, you could call it an ops company or an infrastructure company, but I'm actually an app person, right? Like my background is app dev, right? And I've always liked that side of it, of architecture and things like that. And so I think what's nice is we're sort of moving up out of the plumbing and further towards application and application value. And to me, that's exciting because it's like, that's where all the fun stuff is. It's like, how do I build an app that does a cool thing? It's like, below it, don't get me wrong, I love it, clearly. But to a degree, it can be plumbing, right? And so it's like, how do you get this stuff to just be so brain dead and simple and it just works that you're like, yeah, I don't think about provisioning or scheduling or security. Like those are just baked in, and then I think about the higher level stuff. And to me, that's exciting, is that ability to move up stack.
Awesome answer, Armon. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much. A pleasure as always.